Welcome to another episode of the Straight Up Chicago Investor Podcast. I'm 𝗤𝗏𝗀𝗃. With me, as always, is Mark Ainley. Mark, 2 in 1 day. I get to see you again. How's it going?
Yeah, I put a hat on just in case anyone watch the YouTube videos, so it doesn't look like I wear the same thing every show.
You should have done the glasses with the mustache.
I know. I got rid of my Halloween costumes. I would have came with a nice big fro that I had for one of my costumes.
There you go. So I know you just, before getting this call, we were just talking about you referred someone over to Aaron Zimmerman, who's our guest on episode 52, but it got us talking a little about just accounting, right? And just the importance of it.
Yeah, it's that time of year. I know I had to write a couple checks here in the last couple of months, pretty large checks that I'm really guided by my CPA and all the advice that they give me through my, I think it's not just your one tax return when you start to scale. It ends up being your different tax returns that flow into your other tax returns that flow into some sort of other tax stop before it gets you personally. So, and that doesn't all happen in 1 year, and it's something that happens over time. And I think it's just important that anyone that's looking to scale, start now with the CPA that you want to work with, or find that CPA. I know for me, I went through, from 2003 to now, I think I've gone through three of them. One I outgrew, one retired. One retired, one I outgrew, and then the other where I'm at now, hopefully will be around for the next 20 years. But I think you have to just get comfortable with that person and their guidance. And so seek it sooner than later. If you're buying properties this year or planning on buying properties this year, like you probably shouldn't be filing your tax to H&R Block anymore. So make sure you're seeking out.
Time to upgrade there. Yes. I guess one other note too, just account for those expenses and however you want to do it. But every time you're going to spin up a new LLC, it's not just, I got to pay to spin this up. Like it's another filing, right? As you grow, your taxes will get more complicated. It will become a legit expense to you.
Exactly.
It ties in nicely. We're going to talk about scaling today. But before we do that, what's our housing provider tip of the week?
All right. So this is a housing provider tip of the week. A lot of people, including myself early on, would pass this thought and deal with the problem later, which was silly. You have your on your whether it be a single family home, or your 2-flat, your 3-flat, north side, south side, you have little gaps that get in your soffits and get in the corner of your property. Sometimes you'll see the little crack there. These animals get into your roofs, or your little gap between you. If you got a flat roof between your second floor ceiling and the actual roof, or your pitched attics. And they are tougher to get rid of than the actual tenants here in Cook County. So what I'm saying is make sure that your house is sealed up. If you see the smallest crack, you might think, nothing can fit in there. Think about this. Mice can get into something that is the size of a nickel. They can manipulate their body to get into something the size of a nickel. Same with around your outlets inside the house, but that's a different tip. But on the outside, when you see if you're 2 stories down, and you see a little hole. If you can see a little hole from 2 stories down, there's a good chance an animal can get in there. And you get into these scenarios where you have to hire a professional to get rid of it. It's not your handyman that's going to go crawl up there and be able to bait out the family of raccoons. Now, you might have a handyman that can do that, but usually you're going to have to invest into some sort of wildlife pest control at that point. So make sure that and then on top of it, you got to deal with the resident that's freaking out. Residents freak out when you got a raccoon that's running above your head there. We've inherited a couple of those problems in the last couple of years, and it's if anything, now before we bring out a property, I'm looking that much closer to make sure we're not dealing with that one problem. So keep in mind, keep all of your outside, keep the outside from your inside. So
good stuff. All right. Today's guest brought to us by Renovo. So we appreciate the referrals from our friends over there. But today we're going to talk about scaling. We're going to talk about the South Side. We're going to talk about being bullish on Chicago. Just so much to cover here. But our guest today started out while working a W-2 job, got up to 80 units before leaving the insurance industry, then opened 𝗖𝗏𝗃 Investment Group at the age of 26. He has grown them to over 1,400 units on the South Side and counting, revitalizing neighborhoods, expanding to new areas where others dare not go. We're going to talk about a 300+ unit deal he did right around Midway. A ton of great information from someone who is just killing it here. So without further ado, David Pezzola, welcome to the show. David, how are we doing today?
Doing good. Thank you.
We're excited to have you, man. So one of the motifs is going to be scaling. So before we talk about 𝗖𝗏𝗃, I want to hit on having 80 units under your belt while working a W-2. As someone who was dabbling in both worlds for probably too long before leaving the W-2, man, let's talk about that. That had to be hectic. First off, how did we get to 80? Like, let's talk about the first deal, and let's talk about how did you balance that? Because that's a high number.
Yeah, so it started off just buying condos in 2012, maybe 2011, yeah, 2012, in the West Loop and South Loop. Just the opportunity made sense. I was seeing condos for less than 200 grand, and you could rent them out for 2,000. So it just wasn't, I wouldn't even call myself really a real estate investor then. It was just that I saw an opportunity. And the reason why I saw an opportunity is because I used to live in LA, in downtown LA, where I moved out for a job with AIG in New York and ended up having to rent out that unit. That was the first time I became a landlord. And renting out that unit, I was making some positive cash flow to where all of a sudden, from being a novice, that seemed like the better investment that I had made out of anything else I'd ever invested in, and figured this is kind of on accident. Let's see if I can buy another one in LA where I was familiar, because that's where I used to live. By the time I went to go buy another one, the condo value had gone up by so much that it didn't make sense to invest there. So I had to find a different market, but it was actually very easy to manage a condo from New York, manage a condo in LA. So I figured there was no city that was really off limits. So I started looking at it globally, and on a macro level, it seemed like Chicago made the most sense, which is how I got into Chicago in the first place. And then eventually my first condo I bought, and I forget which one came first, I bought them pretty close one after another, was either at 1645 West Ogden, bought a condo there, and then simultaneously I bought a condo at 1620 South Michigan, which I did light renovations on remotely, just literally hiring a GC that my realtor knew to do a very light renovation, and then rented out both units pretty rapidly for about $2,000 a piece. So it made sense. There's positive cash flow, and I just started doing more. And that's kind of how it started. But to get to 80, there's a lot of things that happened along the way over in the next basically it took about 2 to 3 years from there, 3 years to get to 80 from 2 units. But yeah.
So real quick, the first thing that's probably coming to our listeners' heads who right now own 3 units, 10 units, and are trying to get there, capital, right? How are we either financing all these? Are we pulling money out of existing deals, et cetera? And you don't have to go super in the weeds, but just talk about that, because I think that's one of the hardest parts, regardless of the market's up or down, is at some point you run out of capital.
Right. So the first 2 units were basically 20% down, and I had done well enough at AIG with commissions to be able to put that down and then get a loan for 80%. And then the way I got additional deals done and got additional capital was I was doing well at AIG, so I was making decent commissions over there, is my LA condo, which what I had originally bought for 230 grand, much prior to that, all of a sudden was worth about, I think it appraised out at around 500. So that allowed me to do a refinance on that. It was substantial, allowed me to pull out additional cash tax-free. And then I used that as my down payment to buy additional condos in the West Loop and South Loop. And then the way that I got further than there is that I was fortunate enough that the West Loop got red hot, basically starting as soon as I bought. And that wasn't just me. I got lucky that I picked 2 markets that really shot up, especially the West Loop. And I sold a condo in 1645 Ogden and 1031'd it. And with additional cash, was able to start buying condos in cash in the South Side. And at that same time, I was going to my clients and friends and other people, kind of explaining what I was doing sort of on accident, and started asking people if they wanted to, JV with me and start doing these deals. And that's kind of how it started.
Good stuff, man. So two questions. One, do you see any similarities to any existing Chicago markets to what you saw in the West Loop back then? Right? Is there anything that our listeners can pull from? Because that boat was most likely missed, given today being, 2022. Do you see any similarities in other neighborhoods here in Chicago? And then also, separate question, but man, why not leave at after 40 units? I mean, you hung on for a long time there. Was AIG just that, it was that good of a job, whereas, hey, I want to hold on to this thing?
Well, so actually, I ended up getting a lot of pressure from AIG to leave because I let them know what I was doing. And I got recruited by Mutual of Omaha to come over there. And they said that they were okay with me doing this on the side. So because I was supportive, and also this is still feast or famine. So even when I actually think I left AIG probably around maybe 20 units or so I left, and went to Mutual Omaha. And obviously 20 units, when you're still like, trying to keep them occupied. That wasn't enough to live off of. And it was a huge decrease from what I was making at AIG.
Mm-hmm.
But even when I went to Mutual Omaha, even when I got to 80 units, it still wasn't like it was all 100% occupied, 100% cash flowing all the time. It was still a lot of churn to where it was good to have that steady income. From my and I was willing to like work 7 days a week and work, basically 10 hours a day on my corporate job. And then until I passed out on my real estate job to make sure everything was still moving. But at 80, it was completely overwhelming. There's no way I could do both things sustainably for any period longer. It was just absolutely crushing. They're both more than full-time jobs. And then eventually I just had to leave. Now, while I was at Mutual of Omaha, I had been approached by an investor to where they offered me, they'd offered to invest in 𝗬𝗏𝗏, which at the time just owned the handful of units that were, a little less. They started talking to me when it was probably about like 30, 40 units. And they offered to, put up cash in exchange for a small percentage of 𝗬𝗏𝗏, but more importantly, to give me a credit line of where I could go and buy more. And that was the better part of the deal. Now, the cash was great because it allowed me to step away from Mutual Omaha, but the more important part was the credit line, which allowed me to continue to buy, that was the much more important part of the deal. Even though at the time I was more concerned about valuation than the credit line, but the credit line should have been all I was concerned about, because that's really what I needed to get from 80 to basically 400 over the next couple of years after that.
Got it. Let's table my question on neighborhoods. Let's go down this thread for a second here. So you get the credit line. Do you hire a team at that point, right? Like what are the first steps now that we have a bankroll? What happens next?
So the bankroll wasn't for my organization. The bankroll was actually for acquisitions. The cash, which I originally thought I was going to pocket in exchange for selling some equity, pretty soon became the bankroll for growth and to hire more people. But even then, because I watched that cash that I get where I sold some of the equity, and I wanted to have that be mine. But then pretty quickly it was clear that I couldn't grow without having additional people in-house. So we made our first hire of like true employee of our company, not counting maintenance people that we had and other sorts of things, but a true actual in-house employee. Because I was actually effectively the property manager for our first 80 units, where I was, coordinating maintenance people to get there and doing everything, making the collection calls. I was doing it all myself, like remote property manager living in New York on 80 units in Chicago. And my first hire in-house was, I realized my weakest point was closing out my books, just because I wasn't excellent at accounting and bookkeeping. And also that was what was nails on a chalkboard to me. So I hired a CPA to be my controller. I hired 𝗬𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗁, who's currently actually my COO, but she grew from controller to understanding our whole operation, and now she's our COO. But that was my first hire in 2015.
Got it.
And shortly after that, about a year later, was my second hire, and brought in Jared Snyder, we brought him in as a project manager. His role evolved a ton from then until now. Currently, he's our VP, and both of them were in 𝗬𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗁 was in a one-person WeWork office with me from when she got hired. We found it one weirdly shaped WeWork office where it actually could kind of fit 2 desks. And we both stuffed ourselves in there, and she heard every phone call I made all day. And I was on the phone constantly with lenders, investors, brokers, everything. And I think it was actually really helpful, while probably pretty annoying, is that she got to hear everything that was going on. So she had her vantage point of accounting and being a controller and her experience as a CPA, but she learned everything kind of through osmosis by just being in that tiny room with me for a year straight, working 7 days a week and 10-hour days, if not longer. And then Jared, when he came in, we found a oddly shaped 2-person office that could fit 3 of us. And then similar thing where he kind of learned a lot from osmosis. And so those were my original 2 hires.
That's awesome. And they're also there. So that's cool. So, going on these first 400 units, what were you doing? Major rehabs? Were they, I always call them partial or 70% gut rehabs. Like, what kind of work were you guys having to do on that? Just so kind of give everyone the mindset of how much scope was involved times 400.
So it started off with condos, and that was excellent because a lot of times behind the walls were great because these were like 2004 full condo renovation, or in some cases I think were ground up. Some cases they took a building and they totally got rehabbed it and made it into really nice units. So that was great because we didn't have to really, go behind the walls, and it was just purely a little bit of cosmetic touch up. But as we got bigger, it was harder to find condo deals, and also it wasn't as scalable because to buy some condos and to assume you'll be able to buy the whole building is a bad assumption because it is a lot of steps to get there and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So we found ourselves a lot of condo buildings where we owned a lot of condos in the building, but not the whole building. And that was really tough to get debt on because if you own, 4 condos in 2015 on a 12-unit building, no one wanted to touch that with a loan. Like it was a non-warrantable condo building. It was impossible to capitalize, but the cap rates were actually totally insane. Like we were buying some stuff where the cap rates were like 35% and stuff like that. So while it was not financeable, it's a higher yield than, for the most part, anything we can find now with even perfect leverage. So it made sense, but it just wasn't a scalable strategy because it was really hard to find it. And then you also had a lot of things could go wrong, where the roof could go wrong and you own 3 units of 24, and then yours are on the 3rd floor and you have most of the 3rd floor units, so no one cares about the roof. And so you basically have to front paying for a whole roof for a large building, and you only own 12% of it. And things like that were how we started to learn about doing bigger renovations because we got caught on some things like that where we got a little unlucky. But then we started buying bigger buildings, even though the cap rates were much lower. And doing so, we slowly but surely kind of built a network of GCs. And it was everything from just light renovations to, your 70% guts to some full guts. But it was really all over the board. And we did find a lot of buildings that were former condo buildings that someone else had aggregated all the condos, that we could buy those buildings. And they were a little bit of premium, but I wish I did more of those because those ones we had the least amount of problems with, because at some point they were probably had their COO or they had, the full inspections, and there's really nothing wrong with them. It was the older buildings that had been partially renovated, but behind the walls had issues that were the most challenging and the biggest learning curve on how to get those, back in shape and out of building code.
I still remember it had been 2011, 2012. I made an offer on a property at 1645 West Ogden, 2-bedroom, 2-bath. And it was facing the courtyard. It's kind of a weird building. So it was facing the middle and had one of the beams in the 2nd bedroom. And I justified not raising the price up to 87.5 from the 79 that I was very firm on not going over to. So, man, like I imagine that thing's going for over 250 now, but it's funny that you brought up that address because it's a pain point for me in memories. But
yeah, that building was really interesting. And actually that was kind of, that was a really interesting building because I actually ended up buying 3 units in that building in the early days. My first one I bought for 112. It was a 2-bedroom, 2-bath that I still have, that faces kind of like northwest and a pretty good view. And the other 2 I bought also, one was 2-bed, 2-bath, one was a 3-bed, 2-bath, and I bought them in a package deal for 300. So that was like 150 each. And those ones I sold, and it's funny, I talk about how I 1031'd them, but the first one that I sold there, I still only sold for 240, but at the time that was like a record-setting price. And the main difference why those went up in value so much so quickly is because the HOA wasn't taking enough money in to hit the reserve requirement. They were only taking in 8% of HOA dues, and if they took in 10%, that was enough. So like a 2% raise and having it all go to reserves is all they needed to really do to make it warrantable. And when I realized that, I was thinking, okay, well, if I fix that problem, then everyone can get loans in the building, and it's just a slight tweak. And that's literally all it took. And then people started setting record comps like on a monthly basis. And it was just, next trade was I think 175, and then a 2-2 went for 200. And so when I saw that happening, I sold mine. That was a big pop for being able to 1031.
Before we go on with scaling, can you just talk about making a condo warrantable for our listeners who don't understand? Hey, what does that mean? Just give the 30-second rundown if you don't mind.
Yeah, and of course I'm not as dialed into it anymore because I'm not really going to buy condos at this point. But basically, if you can get a conventional mortgage on a condo building, a lot of times it's just simply a binary yes/no. And there's basically three things, at least when I was doing this heavily, that would make a building not warrantable or warrantable. One of them is a set amount of reserves per unit, and that varies. It could be, I think, $3,000 a unit is, I think, a lot of times the minimum. There needs to be less than 50% need to be it could be investor owned. So you have to have 50% or more owner occupied. And I believe also 10% of all collected HOA dues must be going to a reserve. So I think if you have those three things, I think a building's warrantable generally, where you can get conventional financing. And I've heard some lenders now are doing non-conventional or financing on non-warrantable condo buildings, but generally that's worse rates, worse terms. It's not the really great, 30-year fixed at super low rates that you can get if the building is warrantable. But of course, keep that in mind. If a building's barely not warrantable and you can get it at a 20% discount than one is, and you can get a loan for a slightly higher rate, that's probably a good buy, because there's kind of a shadow value there that's not being harnessed. That's definitely worth keeping in mind.
𝗬𝘃𝗲𝗀𝗏, episode 44. I actually had to send something to him the other day, a non-warrantable one, where basically the deal got held up. Like it was a condo in Bronzeville, 6 flat that just kind of defunct HOA that we're not sure where the HOA fees are going now at this point, but didn't go anywhere, but they do have a program. So we'll link Chris's information here in the notes as well.
Good stuff. All right. So David, we're off to the races here. We're buying bigger buildings, we're buying, I saw it was like 20 units, then 40, then 80. You're basically doubling it every year, and then 600, right? So like, talk us through that process. Like, it's just got to be like chaos, right? So just walk through like some of those steps, some of the learning lessons for someone who's looking to scale.
Yeah. So we talked about getting investors, and it started off with just people that I knew. Through work, people I was working with at AIG and things like that. And then through leveraging them and just asking them, hey, if you know anyone that could write a bigger check, and slowly growing your network and getting to some investors who had bigger capacity, it was kind of a perfect storm. Is that in 2016, I started getting investments from some smaller family offices and high net worth individuals that had a lot more capacity than the deal size I was doing, because I was buying 6 flats and stuff like that. And back then it was like 6 flats in Bronzeville in 2014, 15, 16. I was getting stuff for maybe $50K a door that needed maybe $30K of work. So that's kind of where I was getting deals at. And the perfect storm came along that I was able to sell a package to an institutional buyer. And we made a pretty big hit there. So then all my investors who were new that had more capacity, had it been my earlier investors, even if with a big hit, and they're like, hey, now it looks like you know what you're doing, I want to invest more. They didn't really have much more they could have invested. But I was lucky that I had investors that had capacity far more than I was tapping into. And when I sold a bunch of buildings and there was a big hit, they went from being tepid about the Southside Chicago strategy to, wow, this is pretty awesome, and we want to do more. So we 1031'd a lot of the money. That's why we were able to buy a lot, because I had a lot of pressure now. And now I had to go find a bunch of deals because I had a lot of dollars sitting in a 1031 account that if I didn't deploy, then we lost its tax advantage. So we kind of went on a huge buying spree. And because I knew what their thresholds were of what was a good deal versus what they saw in New York, because a lot of these investors are New York and California based, that everything almost at just fair market price, or top of the market price, was still a really good deal compared to what they could get elsewhere. And the craziest part was that I also realized that they weren't getting materially better debt terms in San Francisco or LA or New York City than I could get in the south side of Chicago. So even if, let's say, you could get 50 basis points better on debt, but I was getting a cap rate that was, 500 basis points better, it was a total no-brainer for our investors to be literally setting records in Bronzeville, being the highest buyer in 2017 of a lot of stuff. So we had 1031 money and investors with a lot of capacity, and I'd kind of locked in my early track record. So that was the perfect storm, which allowed us to have the capital to go in and buy a lot in 2017 and 18. And so that was a whirlwind. It was like I was getting things under contract left and right, closing things. I was hearing rumors that I was the biggest idiot in the world for paying $80K a door for stuff in Bronzeville. And I was fine with that. because the numbers still work. Because at the time it was still like maybe on a broker offering memorandum a 12% cap rate. In reality, probably it was a 9, and probably because we were just learning how to manage it well, it probably ended up being an 8. But even then I could get debt still sub 5. So I had a 3% net leverage spread even when I messed up. So, so we had a big learning curve in that growth period that really pressure tested us, and we learned a lot, and it was very stressful. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess let's pivot then. You mentioned Brownsville and some of these other South Side neighborhoods. What were some of those challenges, right? Like what was, there's a lot that goes on with, Chicago in general. It's very tenant friendly, as we've discussed, ad nauseum here. Talk about some of those challenges and what you might have done differently from the management perspective.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, if you haven't operated in the South Side of Chicago and you're just looking at it, you hear stories, South Side of Chicago is rough. I would say, first of all, that's over exaggerated. But it's not that it's easy, but it's just that not everywhere in the South Side is the same, and not every asset class in the South Side is the same. But the challenges were less about it being the South Side and more about just going from 400 units down to basically 250 units when we did a big sale, and then growing from 250 units to basically over 1,000 in under 18 months. And that growth, whether it was Southside Chicago or anywhere, I think would have been very, very challenging. And I think the biggest difference is, so you hear Southside Chicago, you hear collections are tough and it's tough to manage. Our collections prior to our kind of hyper growth phase were near 100%, which might sound crazy because it wasn't just all Bronzeville, it was also tougher areas. Like we had stuff in Chatham, we had stuff South Shore, Jackson Park, things like that. But we were nearly 100% because I was personally making the collection calls. I was personally meeting with residents who were past due. And I was working out deals to where we didn't have a ton of evictions and we had extremely high collections. Now, it was very stressful. We got close to 400 there, but from 0 to 200, we were near 100%. And then it started trailing off because I had Jared and Jessica also help me with collections. Not saying there's anything wrong with their abilities. They were just newer to it. And, but as you get beyond that, you go from being able to basically do all your collection calls and all your high touch stuff and all your escalated issues, deal with the resident whose heat goes off on Christmas Eve and like talking him off of a ledge and figuring out something personally to make it happen. Cause you're taking that call on Christmas Eve at 11 PM personally. Whereas it's not easy to find a property manager who will take that call and be able to deal with it with the same care that you would, because they don't own the building and you do. So as you kind of tried to copy yourself, as you got further from the source, it was a lot harder to just have that like kind of perfect hands-onness that you really need. And we started losing some of that. So our collections and our hyper-growth phase went from being, I think, basically perfect to dropping off to where we had some bad months that were scary, and we had to really figure out and change our operation. And we were doing that along the way, and we realized that what worked for 200 units barely worked at 400 units. And then we kind of reset it. What worked from 200 to 400 definitely didn't work at 1,000. And so we were just constantly working on the operation and realizing that we probably couldn't be as perfect. So we had to make things simpler. And that was just a huge, growing pains. And it was tough. Yeah.
I think we had the similar path. We started buying stuff down there in 2008. We ultimately bought just under 500 units and all on the South Side. And ultimately we set out to find somebody to outsource it to. We thought our Northwest suburban management, we'll outsource that South Side stuff, and could never find anybody. We started doing it ourselves, but it was a learning curve, and the learning curve came with a lot of work and a lot of, and I always tell people now the amount of touches you have for a 2-flat between tenants, the property, the maintenance, Section 8, all that stuff compared to a 2-flat in Lincoln Park is like 8 to 1. So I hear you on the collections, and as you're trying to grow and it gets from you, that was something we experienced as well too. How have you guys, as your company's growing and your management company's growing, you guys have a lot of units in those type of neighborhoods. What have you guys like done differently to, I'm saying this selfishly a little bit here too, to kind of The thing that a lot of property managers always say in the South Side, a lot of them stink, but it's not necessarily stink. It's just there's so many areas to mess up in. There's so many of those touches. You miss one touch point, all of a sudden the gas gets shut off, and the tenant's complaining because something fell in their whatever it might be. Some crazy stuff happens on the South Side. Like, how have you guys been able to grow to be able to handle that type of those type of touches?
Yeah, it's a great point. So one thing, speaking of touches, right? It's if you send someone to a building, that's one touch for the whole building, right? And so where we realized that we thought our management strain was caused by adding a bunch of units, but in reality, it was caused by adding a bunch of roofs. We realized that ultimately there's a problem at a 60-unit building, then I'm putting my head together with the property manager or a head of CapEx. And as we've grown, we've had more roles, right? But whatever it was, I'm ultimately getting involved and I'm trying to solve a problem. And we solve a problem for a 60-unit building. Let's say the roof has an issue, or there's a permitting issue, or there's city violation issue. Then we have an action plan moving that's going to solve a problem for 60 residents, right? But the same issue happens on a 2-flat, and I spend the same amount of effort to focus through it, and we've solved a problem for 2 residents, right? So we've tried our best since we kind of had that epiphany to try to have less buildings, more units, trying to get bigger buildings, and we really see the benefit of buying bigger buildings for that reason. So it makes things more efficient. It makes things more systematic. It allows you to cover a lot more ground, because if one manager can hit 15 buildings and that's 300 units, a lot better than hitting the same amount of buildings and having it only be 30 units or 40 units. Because it's as many times you have to stop, park, get out of the car, go into the building, check the hallways, walk the building. That's one building. Maybe it's 10 minutes longer if it's 20 units or 30 units or 40 units, but it's a lot better than having 10 stops to check the same amount of units.
Yeah. So let's talk about
that's one
that.
thing we focused on. Yeah.
And so that ties into the 300 unit you just purchased over by Midway. Let's talk through, it's a competitive market.
Yeah.
How did you find this thing? What did you like about it? Finding 300 units is very tough in this market.
Yes. So that was a bit of a creative situation. But yeah, we have basically, that was a portfolio. It wasn't a 300 unit building. It was basically 20 buildings that totaled 300 units, but they're all in a very tight group to where it has kind of the economy of scale as if you bought roughly 300 unit buildings, because a lot of them are really close to each other. But that's an opportunity that arose just in general. You have a lot of people who've operated in these areas for a long time, and they maybe bought the buildings when you could only rent them for $150 in, 30 years ago. And now they're renting them for $800, but the market rent is $1,100, and they just don't want to go through it again with the renovation upgrades of the whole building all over again and do that again and do that last push. So you can find these owners who have these portfolios, and there's meat on the bone, and they're willing to get out and leave meat on the bone because they understand that it's not worth top of the market value because it's not in perfect condition or perfect rent roll, one or the other. I mean, there's always reasons, and they don't want to do that same effort again. And if they could have one buyer that they're confident they can execute, they might be willing to sell you their portfolio or a chunk of it. So that's what that was. And that's lucky. That's a one-off, and we think we'll probably have some of those here and there. We've had one of those before, but that's not something we can count on for being able to always find these constantly, but they're out there. One day maybe we'll be in that position where we want to just start winding things down, and we'd rather have a discounted execution, sell the whole thing, than sell it off to, through in each individual building one by one. Even if you're getting top of the market doing that, that's a much more painful process. And also that scale too, there's some level of legacy you're leaving behind also. Is that, do you want to sell it to one buyer who you're confident is capitalized well enough to take care of it and do well? Or do you want to sell it to 50 different buyers to where maybe, 15 of them run the building into the ground, and it's kind of like people remember it as your building and it looks like crap. They don't know who ran into the ground. Was it you? Was it somebody else? So it's, there's something to that too, where you feel good like being able to offload it to a guy who's going to do a good job.
In these neighborhoods that you are in, mostly C and D class, might have some B minus maybe, but you come across Section 8 a lot. Do you guys have like a ratio on how many you keep market versus Section 8? Do you even do Section 8 at all? Kind of give us your thoughts on that.
We do both. It's so case by case. It depends on the area. It depends on the building quality. It depends on everything. In some areas, no one with Section 8 voucher would even want to apply for it if it's not top end quality. And in some areas, someone with Section 8 voucher, because the area is so great, would apply for it even if the quality's not there. So it's so many factors too. They would determine whether we would, well, it's not even whether we would prefer. It's that you put something up and you're going to get a lot of applications, either, Section 8 or no Section 8, depending on the price point and the quality and the area. So, but we probably right now, if I had to guess, I think we're about like 30% Section 8 and 70% market. That was flipped. Back in 2017 and prior, we were probably 75% Section 8. So it's been a lot more market as time's gone on. And part of that's just the areas we bought a lot in. We bought a lot in Bronzeville, to where Section 8 vouchers in a lot of the areas where we own in wouldn't cover what the Bronzeville rent would be if it's nice renovated product. And so that's kind of just naturally sort of occurring. We're not like trying to take less, it just ended up happening that way.
You're seeing a lot of Section 8 move around with the mobility programs, moving to neighborhoods that they weren't traditionally in, A and B class type neighborhoods. I know, Tom, you and I are working on some right now up in Albany Park, I think it is. And give some advice, any tips or advice you have for people looking to get, I get a lot of other people that call me up and say, I want all Section 8 buildings. Any advice or tips you give soon to be investors on the program?
Yeah. I mean, so I remember the first time I bought something in the South Side that I was so excited to have my first Section 8 voucher to come in. I didn't really know how to deal with it, but I was excited. I'm like, wow, this is guaranteed rent, right? And so that's what that's the headline. It's guaranteed rent, but there's a lot of things that come with that. I mean, you have mandatory inspections every single year. And so you take that into account. What's the cost for that? I mean, sometimes there is not much of a cost to pass inspection, but sometimes there could be a lot of wear and tear in a unit, and you could have a lot of costs. So factor that in. It's tough to really factor that in. It's also a lot of administrative work just to make sure you get it in. And then once you turn it in, I remember the first time I turned one in, I was like, okay, now I need this revenue to come in tomorrow. And it took me 90 days to get through to even get approved for it. And I didn't know what I was doing. So now we have a team that handles this, so we can get things punched through very quickly. But it is a learning curve to know how to deal with that. And it's a totally different thing. I remember that to get a hold of someone, and get a hold of the right person's tough. You can always get a hold of someone in Section 8, but it's a totally different game. So I wouldn't say that the grass is green. I mean, there's really is positives, and there really can be negatives too. So it's tough. It's tough to say that there's not like a silver bullet here to where it's like it's totally better or it's totally worse. It depends on the situation. Sorry to be so vague, but
no, I like it. My opinion, anyone that listens knows, I think in the C and D class areas, when you're solely in there, say you have a 4 flat or 6 units in South Shore, like I'm very to the point of almost going 50-50. I think you have the pros and cons of both, and they kind of balance each other out. And that's kind of how we always grew our portfolio. We were back in 2009, 10. I mean, there wasn't many great market tenants in these neighborhoods, and we were probably about 80%. So similar to how your path was.
No, totally. And the only thing is that things can happen to where if you are, you could have maybe you have an issue with something, and then all of a sudden the whole building, you have to deal with not going into abatement, right? Or something like that. And so there's such strong positives and there can be negatives too. But yeah, I agree. In a D area, Section 8 is going to be, 100% guaranteed money versus it's really tough to underwrite well and get a high confidence that you're going to get all your money coming in every month without Section 8 in some areas. So totally.
Yeah. So David, we're still building most of the portfolio on the South Side here. Even after we've seen this run up in Bronzeville, where are you still investing? Why are you still bullish, right? Like it's awesome to see this. And I want that message to get out to our listeners that there's people still just killing it down there. What excites you? Like, why are you still in Chicago, the South Side? Why are you still bullish? Why are you still here? Why are you still investing here?
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. So first of all, it's despite everyone constantly saying there's depopulation and stuff like that. It's if you actually go do the research, it's not as grim as headlines like to make it. I mean, that's it's just funny. The other day, out of curiosity, right? Yeah. Out of curiosity, I looked at my phone and just searched New York City, where my New York City investors are always complaining how, oh, it's shrinking. And I'm like, wait, looks like New York City actually lost more people the last 5 years than Chicago, but that's not, I guess, exciting news, or that doesn't hit a narrative or something. So it's still the third biggest city in the United States. Even though some people say, no, Houston's third. No, it's not. It's still Chicago, right? So I think that's got to count for something. It's extremely diverse business where it's not just finance. It's not just tech. If tech gets hammered, it's a little bit of a decrease in Chicago. If tech booms, it's a little bit of an increase in Chicago. I talk to my investors like it's the mutual fund of cities where you have so many different industries to where you get like a blended sort of, if everything's going well, Chicago should get a bump. If everything's going poorly, it should get a decrease. But so I like that. I also think there's something to be said once you have scale in a city, that it's hard to just say the grass is green in another city and try to recreate that scale there, because that really does help. I've ventured into Indianapolis and to Detroit. And while on paper, some of our buys over there have been better on paper than in Chicago, that's theoretically on paper. But in actuality, due to various things that come up, we don't have a maintenance team there where we have a full staff maintenance team here with all sorts of trades. We have to outsource so many things. So that hurts you. We also don't have permanent property managers there, there at all times. So, or in some cases doing third-party management, which we have to do, which isn't as efficient. Whereas here we have our full team built out. We don't understand the city regulations as well there as we do now versus Chicago. Chicago now we understand how to operate here. So once you kind of understand, that's worth something as well. But the South Side too, the opportunity is still great, even though Bronzeville prices have shot through the moon. You still look at where cap rates are versus, let's say, the equivalents in other cities. So figure Bronzeville in a lot of ways has similar data to like Harlem, where it's very close to downtown Chicago, just as Harlem's very close to Midtown Manhattan, probably about the same distance. Actually, Bronzeville's closer. And with that close of a radius to downtown, I don't know how the cap rates are even still really where they are. Versus you look at other cities, other markets, and the cap rates are much tighter. And in those other cities, unless it's LA or New York, are lower populated cities. So why would buying in a similar area to Bronzeville in Houston be at such a premium to Chicago? Or, same thing for other places. So I still think your risk-adjusted returns here are good as long as you know how to run it, and you can. And that's a learning curve, but once you get there, I think it really makes sense. And it's a great city. It's a lot of fun. I miss it when I'm out of town. So it's a really fun city. It's a great city. And yeah.
That's funny you say that about different cities, and you're way bigger than us. But I say that about West Side versus South Side. People call me about West Side management all the time. I'm like, I can't have two C and D class operations. Like it's a whole different set of resources to operate in both those.
Totally.
neighborhoods.
Well, it's so true. We're offered stuff in the West Side all the time, but I look at it the same way. If I can't get at least 200 units out there, I can't really set up like a satellite operation over there. And the travel time between anywhere in the South Side, we operate in Bronzeville, Washington Park, Jackson Park, Woodlawn, South Shore, near Midway. Any of those areas are too far away from the West Side to really get there, or else you have a maintenance tech doing 3 work orders a day because he hits one in the West Side, does them back there. It's not efficient. Unless you have 200 units, you can't keep one maintenance tech occupied a whole day out there.
So I'm a suburban kid. Like I'm out in St. Charles, and like I go in and out of the city, no problem. I can hit 10 stops in a day, in a half a day throughout South Suburbs, West Side. But our techs, for some reason, or somebody like they really struggle to move around the city like fast. Like it's like almost a mental block of like, oh man, I gotta go to the North Side today, or I gotta go to the West Side. Like some of our attorney even like he's like, yeah, I'm gonna go out to St. Charles. You got a hotel out here. It's like suburban people going to the city. It's not as big of an obstacle as a city person coming out to the burbs or having to go around to different segments of the city. It's funny.
Totally. No, it's transit's a real thing. I learned that, I didn't really have that epiphany until I read Sun Tzu, The Art of War. And it talks about how it just focuses on travel being so much. Like, you take your army this far, then they lose this much efficiency. I'm like, this is nonsense. And I'm just buying in Detroit, buying in Indianapolis, and then realizing, oh my God, like, I really wish I had like you need a nucleus. You need a home base. Just even traveling from south side to west side it just kills your efficiency. So our thought is, in different markets, we would need to find a deal that's over 200 units, so we at least have enough to set up a satellite over there that where on market rate property management fees can fund kind of some local site people you need there. And if not, then it's just not worth going into a new market. Yeah. And literally too, we look at other markets just to make sure that we're not in an echo chamber, that we're not blind to other opportunities. Because yeah, if there's a place where all of a sudden it's just nothing but 11 caps, then I want to like explore. But I think the South Side Chicago of any major city, it seems to be the best cap rates that we can find, and we're constantly looking for stuff, so.
No, that's great. Great stuff. This reminds me of the 𝗏𝗏𝗶𝗵𝗵 episode we had, where it's just the returns are there, so, and the money will follow and the operators will follow. And so while the music's going here, like, it's there. I think while you guys were talking about travel, one thing that always upsets me, the South Side of Chicago is over 1 million people in population. It's bigger than, Denver. It's bigger than, Minneapolis. It's bigger than some of these major metropolitans, and it gets lumped in. And we've even done it on the show. We ask you like, hey, how is it operating in the South Side? Like that's a poor question, because you wouldn't just ask someone like, hey, how's it operating in Denver? Right? There's multiple classes. There's multiple different, it's diverse. It's crazy. Like, it's completely different in one area compared to the other.
No, and it's interesting because we have about 2,000 units in the South Side of Chicago that we own, and we manage manage another basically 500. So we manage about 2,500 units in the South Side of Chicago. So no matter what metric you're using, we're probably a top 5 operator in the South Side of Chicago. If not, I think we're maybe 3rd or something like that. But it's funny, it does not have the same, effect that if I walk to a room and I'm like, I'm the 3rd biggest operator in Denver. They'd be like, wow. And I'm like, yeah, that's less impressive than being 3rd. I mean,
yeah.
The South Side of Chicago is bigger, and it's more important. And it's funny, but I think that exactly is the reason why there's still an opportunity, because people, for whatever reason, have their reasons for they think that the South Side doesn't make sense, or they don't want to be there, or they heard on the news that it's tough. But I'm from Oakland, California, where everywhere I went my whole life, everyone was like, oh, Oakland, that's really rough. And it's like, have you ever been there? No, but they'll talk trash about it. And South Side Chicago is the same thing. And now Oakland, I think, is the top 5 most expensive city in the United States, or I know it's top 10. And everyone's like, how did that happen? It's like, well, you were just talking shit about it and you didn't even look in it. Whereas I was in Chicago buying stuff in the West Loop and South Loop, and I, was hearing people at bars and stuff talking about how bad the South Side is. And then one day I'm like, wait, have you ever been there? And people are like, oh, no, but like, it's terrible. It's like, so I literally rented a car one day, and I literally just like serpentined, like drove every single block, like in the South Side over a course of a weekend. So an entire weekend driving everywhere in the South Side to really understand it. And just like Oakland, where I grew up, there were some rough blocks and there were some great blocks, and it was a big mix of things. And I found some areas that I identified as these areas look really interesting. And some of them were, because I knew nothing about it. I just went into it totally objectively. I have no tie to Chicago until I started buying here. And I mean, my wife's family is from the Chicago suburbs, but she had no intentions of moving back here. She was living in New York. So that was my only tie, but that wasn't the reason why I bought here. But just driving through everything, I'm like, oh, wow, Hyde Park was really awesome. Looking at price, I'm like, oh, the prices are crazy. But then it was like Bronzeville makes tons of sense because where it is radius-wise downtown, and the prices were really cheap. And I'm like, call me crazy, I'm just going to start buying stuff in Bronzeville. And then also on that list was East Woodlawn. Those are my 2 first places that I identified, like, this just objectively, not just taking eliminating all preconceived notions. Those made the most sense by far. And it reminded me of Oakland, specific areas in Oakland that were very similar to those 2 areas that everyone's like, oh, those areas are terrible. And then all of a sudden, wait, how did it get so expensive? It doesn't make sense. Like, well, I don't think you were looking, and I think that's what I see about the South Side of Chicago.
Awesome, man. Awesome show. We could probably go for another hour easily, but we're going to move to our wrap up.
Get to the wrap.
Yep.
Mic drop and get to the wrap there.
Yep. Mic drop. Yep. All right. So what's your competitive advantage? How have you been able to do what you've done when others wish they could?
Well, I think part of it's luck, that I got lucky that I got hooked in with some good investors at the right time, to where I was able to get them an early exit and get them to have the confidence to reinvest. The easiest time to go get someone to invest dollars when you're with your right hand handing them a check back for all their money, and then saying, oh, and with your left hand, here's a new deal. So I was lucky that that happened, and I was able to show new deals right away while I had 1031 money locked up. And that really helped me to scale. So that's how I got in there and grew from, not having really anything in the South Side of Chicago to having a lot. And that was, then part of that was that I lived in New York at the time, where in New York, you can't walk into a bar without being around many millionaires. I mean, it's an easy place to raise money if you have good deals. And so that was helpful. But I think my competitive advantage since then, and I hate saying this because it almost negates what I'm saying, is that I really try to approach everything without preconceived notions in general. I think that as soon as I start thinking that I know something and something's definitely set this way, that it inherently puts blinders on. And every time that I've made a mistake or had an issue, like we had, when also we had a panic, like, oh my God, collections dropped for a little bit. How do we fix it? It was because I thought everything was just going to continue exactly how it was. And I started to gain preconceived notions that, yes, of course, we're going to continue to collect, almost 100% of rent, everything that we do. And then that was a terrible assumption, right? And so just really trying to discipline myself, take a step back, not having an issue if anyone in an organization corrects me, trying to keep it flat to where everything from that no one in our organization, we now have, let's say, roughly 55 people. I try to keep it as open door as possible, to where if anyone thinks we're going towards an iceberg, I want them to know and not think that they're going to be embarrassed to tell me, just to make sure that we can make adjustments constantly and keep growing and not be stuck in our ways. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if that's a competitive advantage or not. We're also looking globally too, is that we have investors kind of from all over the country. We're looking at other deals, not necessarily to do other deals in other places, but just to make sure that this still is a good place to put capital and to kind of know everything holistically. So we're not just Southside Chicago, and that's basically all we buy. We try to kind of know everything. We want to know affordable housing. We want to know workforce housing. We want to know if our deals are still more competitive. We want to make sure that we can get competitive debt on it, that we're always looking nationally for lenders. And we're not putting any sort of blinders on what we're doing.
Good stuff. David, what's one piece of advice you would tell someone that is yet to buy their first property here in Chicago?
Tough. I'd say and it sounds a little bit crazy, just buy something that's on the lower end of your price range. Just do it, because you're not going to really learn about anything until you actually do it. I mean, you can study it for forever. A mentor of mine says there's a type of person who just does this: aim, 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 and never takes a shot, right? And it's probably not saying it's always better to aim shoot, but if you're aiming the 10th, 20th time, you haven't pulled the trigger yet, just pull the trigger or just stop wasting your time on this, I think, because you're never going to have all your variables figured out. Some deals I thought I made huge mistakes on that I overpaid afterwards turned out to be some of my best deals. Some deals that I was like, oh my God, I hope this closes because I'm stealing this from this person. They're such an idiot. Once they find out, were some of my worst deals, right? So and now I know why those deals were good and the other deals were bad. And so you constantly keep updating your knowledge base, but it takes doing some deals, and you learn a lot more from your failures than you do from your successes. In fact, some of my early successes were some of the worst things that happened to me, because I figured, of course, this is what's going to continue to happen. And I keep doing this. And it's the failures that actually make change, because you're like, well, I can't do that again. And so I don't know. So just go out there and make mistakes and get some wins and some losses,
Perfect.
Just get out there and make a transaction, and then you'll learn so much more than you'll learn from any book or any podcast. Just make your first transaction and see how that goes.
Love it. I love that advice. I love it. You have a little more risk in the market, higher pricing than you might have 10 years ago, but still, you can still do it. Just buy something conservative.
Oh, okay, fine. So the advice on that is cash flow. Is that buy something at the lower end of your price range that, at least on paper, should be at least a little bit cash flow positive pretty quickly. So then if you're off, you're not bleeding and you don't become a desperate seller. Because the number one way to find a good deal is you find a desperate seller. So you just don't want to be that. You don't want to be a good deal for somebody else because you're screwed. And if the market collapses, but you still have some positive cash flow, you're never a desperate seller because you're never toast. You're never like, okay, I have 10 months left before I'm going to bleed out. It's that, well, I'm not making much money, but I'm not bleeding. So you could stay there for years.
All right, David, what do you do for fun?
For fun? Well, I work quite a bit, but love hanging out with friends, having drinks, going out, just kind of decompressing. And I used to play football, but don't play anymore. I mean, was in a league when I was in New York, but in a competitive fantasy football league. That's pretty fun. Now that's over now. But yeah, no, I mean, really, I actually, to be honest, what I do for fun is like work on this business and keep growing this. I'm here. This might make me sound like a loser, but I'm here on Saturdays and Sundays. It's fun to go out with clients. It's fun to go out with investors, go on trips with them, go out dinners with them. But yeah, like really, like I have fun growing this and trying to like keep taking this to the next level. So that's kind of a weird answer. It's like an interview question for myself that someone would say to me that I wouldn't believe them if I interviewed them and they said, oh, I like growing the business. Like, that's bullshit. But I really do. I mean, I love it. I'm in my office more than in my house for sure. Not even close. Like I'm in my house to basically sleep.
My mentor and my shrink told me I need to find a hobby because I feel the same way as you. It's
yeah, it's like, it was embarrassing. I'm like, what can I say? I don't know what to say. Is I like to do for fun. But I mean, I do like, at this point, what's funny, and I'm not just saying this in case I'm being audited, but like at this point, basically all of my friends and anyone that I would have a drink with or go out with are basically people I either do business with, they're people at my organization, or they're potential investors, and they're all like legitimate write-offs. Like I write off every dinner I have because every single person I spend time with is actually someone who is an investor, could be an investor, someone that I could work with, potentially a new GC, a new an agent that might have some deals coming up. And that's kind of like my friend group, is people that are involved in this business. And I keep adding people who I can do deals with, into my circle. And that's who I hang out with.
I also just love that idea of, I'm just going to go on record and say that, whether it's true or not. I know you're saying it is true, but I do love that angle there. Like, oh, I'll just go on and see, I was recording.
All I was thinking about is our podcast can get entered in some IRS audit case down the road as evidence. I love it. I'm down.
I want to get subpoenaed for something.
So funny. Don't want that.
David, what's a good book, podcast, or self-development activity that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, this is obviously the best podcast.
There you go.
No, to be honest, I don't really listen to a lot of podcasts. I think it's a good book and sounds funny. And reading Rich Dad Poor Dad was such a good book. Kind of got my head thinking around cash flow, and it seems like what a cliche recommendation. But I read that, and that got me to be like, I need to buy another condo. This makes a lot more sense. And understanding cash flow, I read some other books, like his book on property management, his book on real estate investing. Those are all extremely useful, despite the fact I hate saying mainstream stuff. Like my favorite movie is Fight Club. It's like, yeah, so is every guy within 5 years of your age too, but that it's just like one of those, right? But those great books. I also read a lot of books that I think just try to read a book every month, or at least every other month, I think is hugely important. Like nonfiction books, they all have some impact. They all have a 3 or 5% that are of huge value. Like actually, Think and Grow Rich, I read a long time ago. I still use principles in that constantly to plan my years. It's good for goal setting and thinking about things. And actually, Psycho-Cybernetics, not real estate related, but really good about just like having a good self vision and figuring out how to optimize yourself and be the best you can be. That's one that I recommend a lot. And those are books I read well before I did my first real estate investment.
Besides yourself, name one person in your local network that you'd highly recommend to other investors as a quality resource.
Well, I don't want to give away any of my brokers. So unfortunately, a lot of people that I'd recommend, I don't want to say it on a forum. Who can I say that? And I also don't want to recommend my GCs, or else my price to do my own GCs are going to go up when all your listeners start asking for quotes.
Well, you're referred to us by Renovo, so there's your guy jail free card if you want to use them.
Yeah, but I'm still trying to broker those guys to people. So with our in-house, we broker it to our property management clients. But yeah, no, Renovo is awesome. I highly recommend them. the fact that they can do just common sense loans so quickly without making you go through all these hoops and boxes, and the fact they can get draws out so quickly, I wish they could do every single type of loan that we need. And if they could, I probably wouldn't go to another lender ever, and I would just work with them. And I have been working with them even on some of their stuff when they're more expensive for our renovation loans. And people are like, wait, you guys are your size, you still de novo? It's like, yeah, they can put money out fast, no red tape. I treat it like it's cash because I know they're going to be there. Whereas I have some more institutional types that would lend at a much lower rate, but they're a lot more fee heavy, and they're a lot slower, not necessarily as reliable. So I love Renovo.
I like that reference of common sense. It's a good way to describe them. They're good at looking at something and being real about it versus making you jump through hoops.
Totally.
It's unnecessary.
Totally.
Yeah. Even I'm on a much smaller scale, just that reliability, man. Like you put earnest money out there and you're saying cash offer, and you're going to use an acquisition line in the background. They better come through, right? Like that's, just even 100%. On a smaller scale, and you're doing it at a much larger, like, putting a lot of dollars hard or whatever it might be. You got to have the backup.
Oh,
right?
And let me tell you something. Is it earnest money, even if it's refundable? It doesn't necessarily mean it's refundable. It also doesn't mean that you're not going to be in court for 2 years trying to get it back, right? So you want to make sure that you can close, when you put that earnest money out, and then you can close in a timely fashion, because you'll definitely lose it if you don't close in time, if you make it non-refundable. But you need to know that you're going to close.
Too.
And for those, what?
Lose the broker relation too, right? Even at a macro level, it'll affect that.
Oh, totally. I mean, depends. You might not, because brokers like selling buildings, and when if you give them a listing, even if you had they'll probably take the listing later.
You can buy back. You can buy the loyalty back.
You can buy yourself back. That's for sure. But yeah, no, Renovo is awesome. And they're really reliable. I've actually yet to have them not be able to close, except for one time, but there's good reasons why they didn't close. But yeah, it was, they're extremely reliable.
Awesome. David, you provided so much value to our listeners. How can they learn more about you? Is there any way they can provide value to you?
Okay. So I've always wanted to write a book on just kind of like how to do this, but I was actually doing this too much to ever write that book. So I got about 80 pages in and kind of just like, well, I'm just going to keep doing this, and never finished it. So one day when that book's done, which maybe if I have any dead time at any point in time in the next 5 years, I'll finish it. Hopefully the data that I have there is still relevant. That'll be a way that they can learn more about me. But that's not there yet. Ways that they can help me is if anyone finds off-market deals that are in, Bronzeville, Woodlawn, Washington Park, our target areas I mentioned earlier, Jackson Park, South Shore, near Midway, that are over 10 units and have a low per door cost. If the more jacked up, probably the better, the more we can add value. We'll be able to buy it if it fits our strike zone. So we love getting good flow of off-market deals, and they could send them to info@Icarus Investment Group. Actually, no, we got a new domain too. So info@Icarus.co. So info@Icarus.co. They can send them there, and we'll respond relatively quickly if it hits our strike zone or not. And then secondly, if anyone is an accredited investor, we're launching a new fund right now. And so, they can get more details off our website at Icarus.co. So Icarus.co, and they can fill out an inquiry there. And if they're accredited, then we can talk about our new fund that we're launching, because I'm pretty excited about that. And it's going to help, because one of the strains we had in the past is that we did each deal one by one. So we had like 35 different partnerships. We've now consolidated all of those, but administratively, it was like we had to close out one set of books every single day from the previous month, and we'd still be 5 behind, So it was crazy. So now we've consolidated almost all of our partnerships. We realized to grow in the future, we don't want it to be a partnership per deal, because that way we can attack those smaller deals and not create all these new partnerships again and have 35 sets of books we have to close out every single month. So now we've consolidated to where we only have about, I think, 5 partnerships or so, and we're going to launch this new fund. And that's going to be my main focus the next 2 years, is just getting out there and just buying up all the buildings that are kind of on the lower side of what we're looking for, because they're generally the most profitable, like the 10 to like 30 unit buildings, even though I'd rather have 100 unit buildings. I just can't find good deals there. So I'm definitely interested in talking to some accredited investors.
Awesome. Good stuff. All right. So we wrap with the Chicago fact. Now, David, I know you played some college football, so we do have a football question here. So you need some Chicago roots probably, though. Mark, I'll give you a 50-50 shot here on getting this. That's the line on Mark getting this one right here. All right. So just like how we're currently set up with a North Side and South Side baseball team, most of our listeners are probably too young to remember that Chicago used to also have a North Side and South Side football team. What was the name of the team that graced the South Side of Chicago up until 1959?
You had the Chicago Cardinals.
That's correct, Mark.
Is that it? Okay. They
that
played
is
at
it.
Wrigley
Don't
Field,
second guess yourself.
So you threw me off. I thought they played at Wrigley Field.
You had both the Bears and the Cardinals. The Cardinals played up there, and then down here, it was the Stanleys that became the Bears, if I'm getting this correctly.
Yes.
And for a while, you had the Bears and the Cardinals both in the city up until 59. Cardinals moved to St. Louis, where you had both the baseball and football team as the Cardinals, and then eventually made their way out to Arizona.
Yep.
One other fun fact on that: the Chicago Cardinals have the only distinction, or the distinction of being the only team in American professional football to score exactly 4 points in one game, 2 safeties.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I'm assuming they lost.
Yeah, I'm assuming they lost, but that'd be awesome. A 4-0.
It was 4-3. All right, David, awesome show. Tom, thanks as always. Listeners, refer us to a friend today. Please help us spread this podcast to other real estate investors in Chicago. We're already a niche podcast, so it means our audience can only cap so big. But right now, I know we have capacity to add thousands more listeners to us weekly. So please share this with your investment clubs, your investment friends, your investment Facebook groups, and help us share the stuff that we're trying to pull out of our awesome guests like David with the rest of your friends, family, and fellow investors. So David, thank you. Tom, thank you. And we will see you soon.
Thanks all.